You meet someone at a party, a swipe turns into a date, a coworker becomes something more. You think you are choosing them. Your gut says yes or no within seconds, before you have a single conscious reason why. That feeling did not start with dating apps, and it did not start with parties. It is older than language, older than agriculture, older than the idea of a wedding. Long before anyone wrote down a single rule about marriage, humans were already choosing, rejecting, comparing, and competing for mates. And the logic behind those choices still runs underneath every decision you make about who you want. For most of human history, there was no courtship as we understand it. No flowers, no rings, no apps. A small band of people, maybe 20 to 50 individuals, moving together across a landscape that could kill them in a dozen different ways. Inside that group, every choice about who to pair with carried weight that modern dating rarely does. Choose badly and a child might not survive. Choose well and your genes, your habits, your whole way of seeing the world had a chance to continue. So how did people actually decide? Not with checklists, not with conscious reasoning most of the time. The selection ran on cues the body had been refining for millions of years. Cues tied to health, fertility, strength, kindness, and 100 small signals nobody had words for yet. Start with the obvious assumption, the one most people carry without examining it, that ancient humans mated mostly with whoever was nearby and willing, because survival left no room for pickiness. There is some truth in that. Mobility was limited. A person's mating pool in the Pleistocene might have been a few dozen individuals across a handful of neighboring bands. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, studying the Hadza foragers of Tanzania, found that even in small modern hunter-gatherer populations, people still travel between camps, specifically to find partners outside their immediate group, sometimes walking for days. So even with limited options, choice was already happening. People were not simply pairing with whoever stood closest. If you are enjoying this so far, hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I actually read them. That detail starts to crack the assumption open. If movement for mating already existed tens of thousands of years ago, then preference existed too. Genetic evidence backs this up in a more concrete way than anecdote ever could. Geneticist Eva Chan and her colleagues analyzed ancient DNA from skeletons found near Sunghir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, and found that the individuals buried together were not closely related, despite living in what looked like a tight-knit group. That single finding tells you something enormous. Even in the depths of the last ice age, people understood, on some level encoded into their behavior if not their conscious minds, that pairing too close to home carried risk. They were already avoiding it before anyone had a word for inbreeding. The question becomes what they were actually looking for once that nearby pool was ruled out. And the answer starts with the body, because the body was the only resume anyone had. There was no way to check someone's intentions on a profile, no friend group to vouch for them, no history to scroll through. What you could see was what you got, and what you could see mattered enormously. Evolutionary psychologist David Buss spent years gathering data across more than 30 countries on what people say they want in a partner, and one pattern showed up again and again, regardless of culture, language, or geography. Women across nearly every population studied placed unusually high weight on a partner's ability to provide resources and protection, while men across the same populations placed unusually high weight on signs of youth and health. Buss published this cross-cultural work in 1989, and it became one of the most cited studies in the field. Critics have pushed back on how universal those patterns really are, and modern researchers stress that culture and economic structure shape mate preference far more than the original framing suggested. But the raw signal, resources on one side and fertility cues on the other, kept appearing across wildly different societies, which suggests something older than any single culture was running underneath. Here is what that actually means for a Pleistocene woman raising a child with no hospitals, no stored food beyond what the group carried, and predators in every direction. A partner who could hunt successfully, share meat, defend against threats, and stick around mattered enormously, because a single mother in that environment faced brutal odds. And for a man, signs like clear skin, Full hair, a particular waist-to-hip ratio, and youthful movement were not arbitrary preferences. They were rough, imperfect, but statistically real signals of fertility and health in an era with no other way to check. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe spent years living among the Hadza and recorded something that complicates the resource story even further. Hadza men who were the most successful hunters did not necessarily end up with the most partners or the most surviving children, the way a simple resource-based theory would predict. Marlowe found instead that generosity in sharing the meat, rather than hunting skill alone, predicted social standing and mating success. A skilled hunter who hoarded his kills gained little. A hunter who shared widely, even with people outside his own household, built the kind of reputation that made him a more attractive long-term partner. The resource itself mattered less than what a person did with it once they had it, which tells you that early mate choice was already filtering for generosity as a trait, not just capability. This is a small but important correction to the popular image of cavemen competing purely on size and strength. The competition was real, but the prize often went to the person who handled resources with the most grace, not the person who simply accumulated the most. This pattern shows up again in the archaeological record in an unexpected place: burial sites. At Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered a triple burial dated to around 28,000 years ago, 2 males and 1 female interred together with extraordinary care, covered in ochre and ivory ornaments. Researchers have debated the relationships between the three for decades, but what nobody disputes is the level of investment the group put into honoring whatever bond connected them. Whatever the exact configuration of that relationship, it tells you that pair bonds, triads, and complicated human attachments were already significant enough 28,000 years ago to warrant the most elaborate burial ritual archaeologists have found from that period. People were already building their identities, and apparently their grief, around who they had loved. None of this means people were calculating spreadsheets in their heads. They were not. The selection happened through attraction, through a flush of interest or discomfort that arrived faster than thought. That is the part that gets missed when people imagine ancient mate choice as some kind of cold market. It rarely felt like a market from the inside. It felt like a pull toward one person and indifference toward another, the same way it feels now. But resources and fertility cues only explain part of the picture, and this is where the story gets more interesting than the simple version most people repeat. Researchers studying the Aka and Nandu peoples of Central Africa, including work published by anthropologist Bonnie Hewlett, found that both groups consistently ranked qualities like kindness, fairness, and a good sense of humor above physical attractiveness when describing what made someone a desirable partner. That finding does not fit neatly into a story about pure physical selection. It points towards something else mattering just as much, maybe more, in small group survival. Whether a person was good to be around for decades, not just good to look at for one season. Think about why that would matter so much in a band of 30 people who could not simply leave if things went badly. There was no separate household to retreat to, no privacy, no anonymity. A cruel or unreliable partner did not just hurt one person. They destabilized the whole group's cooperation, food sharing, and childcare. So temperament became a survival trait in a mate, not a romantic bonus. The people who chose partners based partly on fairness and generosity were choosing partners who would not collapse the social fabric everyone depended on. There is a biological mechanism that may help explain why kindness became such a powerful filter, and it comes from an unlikely place: foxes. In a decades-long breeding experiment started by Soviet geneticist Dmitry Belyaev in 1959, researchers selected silver foxes for one trait alone: tameness around humans, breeding only the calmest individuals generation after generation. Within a few decades, the foxes had not just become tamer. Their ears flopped, their tails curled, their faces grew rounder, and their stress hormone levels dropped sharply compared to wild foxes. Selecting for one behavioral trait reshaped the entire animal. If something similar happened across early human history, with kindness and low aggression being selected for again and again, because aggressive partners destabilized small, interdependent groups, it would explain a strange feature of our own species. Humans are unusually tame compared to our closest primate relatives, with lower reactive aggression than chimpanzees, despite comparable brain size. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that humans essentially domesticated themselves through exactly this kind of social selection against aggression, and mate choice would have been one of the primary mechanisms driving it, one quiet rejection at a time. This is where the complication arrives, because if cooperation and kindness mattered that much, you would expect mate choice to be calm, deliberate, almost communal. It was not always that simple. Competition for mates among early humans could be intense, and not always in ways that look noble from the outside. Among many primate relatives, and likely among early humans as well, male competition involved displays of strength, status, and sometimes direct conflict. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy's research on primate mating systems documented how female choice itself acted as a powerful filter, with females in many primate species actively avoiding aggressive males and favoring those who showed patience around infants, a pattern she argued likely shaped early hominin mate preference as well. In other words, female choice was not passive. It was an active force shaping which traits got passed forward, sometimes against what male competition alone would have produced. If this is making you think, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. This channel only exists because of the people who share these videos, and I don't take that lightly. So now the picture has three forces pulling at once: physical cues tied to fertility and health, resource and protection signals tied to survival, and social temperament tied to long-term cooperation inside a tiny, inescapable group. None of these forces fully explains mate choice on its own, and that is the deeper truth most simplified explanations skip past. Ancient mate selection was not one mechanism. It was several systems running simultaneously, sometimes agreeing, sometimes pulling in opposite directions inside the same person's chest. Hrdy's work goes further than just describing female preference for gentleness, and the extension matters. She documented that among several primate species, females actively sought out multiple partners, not purely to find the single best mate, but as a strategy to confuse paternity and reduce the risk of infanticide by males who might otherwise kill offspring they suspected were not their own. If early hominin females practiced anything resembling this strategy, even in modified form, it reframes a huge amount of what people assume about ancient pair bonding. The image many people carry of one woman and one man bonded exclusively for life from the earliest stages of human history may be far less universal than it feels. Hrdy has argued instead that flexible, sometimes overlapping relationships, combined with cooperative child-rearing involving grandmothers, older siblings, and unrelated group members, may have been the more common pattern, a model she calls cooperative breeding. Under that model, mate choice was never just about picking one partner. It was about building a surrounding web of people willing to help raise a child, with the romantic partner being one important node in that web rather than the entire structure. There is another layer that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story, and it has to do with who actually had the final say. For a long time, the assumption in evolutionary psychology leaned heavily toward men choosing and women being chosen, largely because that pattern shows up in some primate species and fit older theoretical models about parental investment. But more recent fieldwork complicates that picture significantly. Among the Hadza, studied extensively by anthropologists Frank Marlowe and Kristen Hawkes, divorce and remarriage happen frequently, and women initiate separations from unsatisfying partnerships about as often as men do. That is not a society where women passively wait to be chosen. It is one where ongoing mate choice, the freedom to leave and choose again, shaped pairings as much as the initial attraction did. That detail matters because it shifts the whole frame. Mate choice in ancient human life was not a single decision made once. It was closer to a continuous evaluation, renewed constantly, where both people retained leverage to walk away if the partnership stopped working. A relationship that looked stable from outside could have been the product of years of renegotiation, not one moment of selection at the start. This is closer to how modern relationships actually function than the simplified just-so story of one dramatic choice usually suggests. And then there is the part almost nobody mentions: kin and group preference, the role other people played in steering who paired with whom. Among many documented forager societies, parents and older relatives had real influence over potential matches, not through formal arranged marriage in the modern sense, but through subtle social pressure, introductions, and disapproval that shaped who felt welcome to approach whom. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner's long-term work with the Ju hoansi of the Kalahari documented how extended kin networks actively discouraged pairings that would strain food-sharing obligations between camps, and favored matches that strengthened alliances between groups. A mate was never purely a personal choice in that environment. It was also a political and economic decision for an entire extended network, whether the two people falling for each other realized it or not. So picture an early human, drawn towards someone by a flush of attraction they could not fully explain, evaluating that person's temperament across months of shared meals and shared danger, all while a web of relatives quietly weighed in on whether the match strengthened or threatened the group's web of alliances. None of those forces canceled the others out. They layered. Attraction provided the spark, temperament provided the filter for whether the spark was worth keeping, and the surrounding group provided the boundaries within which all of it played out. Mate choice in deep human history was simultaneously the most personal decision a person could make and one of the most socially supervised. Wiesner's research adds one more wrinkle that rarely makes it into popular retellings. The Ju hoansi practiced something called Hxaro, a system of delayed, reciprocal gift exchange between distant partners that has nothing to do with romance on the surface, but everything to do with it underneath. A young person's parents would often arrange Hxaro exchange partnerships with families in distant camps, specifically to build goodwill that could later support a marriage between the two families' children. By the time two young people actually met and felt anything resembling attraction toward each other, an entire economic relationship between their families had often already been quietly under construction for years. The personal spark arrived inside a structure that adults had been building long before either of the two people involved knew it existed. This reframes something important about modern dating, which often gets described as uniquely chaotic, uniquely commercialized, uniquely difficult, compared to some imagined simpler past. The truth running underneath the data points somewhere else. Ancient mate choice was never simple. It was layered with biology, economics, temperament, politics, and the unpredictable pull of attraction, all operating at once inside people who had no language for any of it. What changed is not the complexity. What changed is the scale and the anonymity. A modern app puts thousands of strangers in front of you, with none of the kin oversight. None of the slow temperament testing across months of shared hardship, none of the small group accountability that used to filter out cruelty quickly. The selection pressures that built human attraction did not disappear. They are just operating in an environment they were never designed for, which may explain why so much of modern dating feels both familiar and strangely hollow at the same time. Consider what got stripped away specifically. The Ju hoansi Hxaro system meant a poor match carried consequences for two entire extended families, which gave everyone involved a reason to invest in making it work, or at minimum to weigh in honestly before things got serious. The Hadza pattern of frequent, low-cost separation meant nobody was trapped, but it also meant reputations traveled fast inside a camp of 40 people, so unreliable behavior had nowhere to hide. A modern city of millions removes both of those pressures at once. There is no extended family economically tied to the outcome, and there is enough anonymity that a person's reputation rarely follows them between dates, the way it would have followed someone between two camps a day's walk apart. The filtering systems our attraction evolved to lean on, community memory, shared stakes, slow accumulated evidence of character, are mostly gone, while the attraction itself, built across hundreds of thousands of years to expect those supports, is still running exactly as before. There is one more thread worth pulling, because it changes how all of this should be read. Genetic studies of ancient human populations, including analysis published by population geneticist David Reich and colleagues, have found surprisingly low effective population sizes in some early human groups, hovering far below what would be expected if mating had been close to random. That kind of bottleneck pattern is consistent with strong, persistent mate selection over many generations rather than chance pairing. In plain terms, the genetic record itself carries the fingerprint of choice. Humans were not simply mating with whoever happened to be near them. Something was filtering, generation after generation, and that filtering left a measurable trace in our DNA millennia later. A separate strand of genetic research points at an even stranger kind of filtering, one running on biology nobody could have consciously perceived. Studies on a set of immune genes called the Major Histocompatibility Complex, conducted by researchers including Klaus Wedekind in a well-known 1995 experiment, often nicknamed the Sweaty T-shirt study, found that women tended to prefer the body odor of men whose immune gene profiles differed most from their own, a pattern that would produce offspring with broader immune defenses. Nobody involved in that preference is consciously evaluating immune compatibility. The selection happens through smell, through an attraction that feels arbitrary and personal, but is quietly doing genetic accounting underneath. If something resembling this mechanism operated across the deep past, it means part of ancient mate choice was running on signals too subtle for language to ever capture, chemical conversations between bodies that the conscious mind was never invited to. That fact deserves a moment to sit with. Every preference you carry today, the instinctive flicker of interest or disinterest when you meet someone new, is the surviving residue of an enormous, ancient filtering process that ran for hundreds of thousands of years across uncountable individual choices nobody recorded. Nobody wrote down why one early human chose one partner over another. There was no diary, no letter, no explanation passed down. But the outcome of millions of those small, unrecorded choices is sitting in your own instincts right now, in the half-second of attraction or hesitation you feel before you even know why. It is worth remembering that none of the individual people running these ancient calculations knew they were part of anything larger. A woman near Dolní Věstonice, grieving a partner 30,000 years ago, was not thinking about evolutionary fitness or genetic bottlenecks. She was thinking about one specific person who was gone. A Hadza man sharing meat with a camp he was not obligated to feed was not running a calculated bid for reputation, at least not consciously. He was being generous because that was who he was, or who his upbringing had shaped him to be. The system worked precisely because it did not feel like a system from the inside. It felt like love, like loyalty, like simple human preference, the same way it still feels today, even though we now have names for the machinery underneath it. So when you wonder why you are drawn to certain people and not others, why kindness eventually outweighs a pretty face for some people and not others, why some relationships feel politically complicated even when nobody is plotting anything, you are not malfunctioning. You are running an ancient system, built across 100,000 generations of small bands, deciding who to trust with their lives, their children, and their food. The system was never simple, and it was never supposed to be. It was built to weigh fertility against temperament, attraction against alliance, instinct against the slow judgment of people who had seen 100 relationships rise and fall around the same fire. The next time attraction hits you before you can explain it, that is not randomness. That is a very old machine, still running, still doing exactly what it was built to do long before anyone had a word for love. Thank you for watching until the end. If this changed how you see something, check out the videos on screen. I think they will hit the same way. And subscribe if you haven't. See you in the next one.